Hello guys, this is Tafazwa from StackDev and welcome to my YouTube course. In this tutorial, we are going to look at GraphQL using Quarkus. So GraphQL is a query language for API that is mainly run at runtime of a program, which means those queries will be executed during runtime of a program. So what this means is GraphQL, it allows a concept of querying data in a specific graph or in a specific format, which means you only get what you ask for. So for example, take an example where you have a service and where you have users that are specifically using that service and it has different subscriptions attached to it. So what this means is when you want to query data over a graph, the data or the information that you ask for is what you get, right? So which means you as a client, or you from the client's perspective, you are the one who detects or who annotate the data, or who declares the shape of the data that you want to ask for, and the server will simply bring you the data that would have asked for. So GraphQL, it actually runs over an HTTP protocol. One of the advantages of GraphQL is you simply run those queries over a single endpoint, right? Unlike REST API, sometimes you might need to create a different endpoint for a different specific thing. But with GraphQL, since it's sort of like an object-based approach where you actually query data in a specific form or shape, which means there's no essentially development that would need to be done at the backend perspective. So think of I can give you another example where you want to query data. So for example, let's say you've asked, let's say, for username from a system, and sometimes you actually see that if you are implementing such implementation on a REST endpoint, sometimes you might be given data that you don't necessarily need, right? So you might get data like maybe last login, like for example, this user last login on this specific date. Sometimes might be given a password if the REST layer is not actually implemented correctly, right? But for the most part, with GraphQL, you actually get what you have asked for, right? So for example, if you want to just get, let's say, the last login date, this is what you request, right? So with that said, so with that approach, it actually means that it solves the problem of overfetching and underfetching data, right? So with these examples, right now I'm simply on the GraphQL website, the official website for GraphQL. So some examples that you can actually see right here on the screen. So for example, let's say you have a hero endpoint, right? A hero object that you want to query data, right? So what you ask is what you exactly get. So in this case, someone over the GraphQL client, they've asked for the name, the height, and the other data, right? So which means when you get the data, you simply get exactly what you would have asked for, right? So this is one of the beauty of GraphQL, and this will be run over the HTTP server, but via a single endpoint, right? One of the advantages of GraphQL is it also allows you to query multiple resources over a single HTTP request, right? So what this means is if you have different models that are implemented, for example, and these models, they have relationships that they have, right? So let's say we have model A, model B, model C, and for the most part, these models have relationships, right? So which means if you ask data over a single query layer, you simply specify the data that you want to get for over a single object, right? So there are so many advantages of GraphQL that we can mention. So in this case, I think for the most part, we simply want to jump into a tutorial, but just a brief introduction. Just know that GraphQL allows you to query data over an object. So which means you as a client, you specify the shape of the object or the shape of data that you want to query, and then GraphQL simply give you that information. GraphQL, it doesn't simply perform what we would call GET requests in REST APIs or queries in GraphQL. GraphQL allows you to do things like mutation. So if you want to change data, that is to post data, to delete data, or to update specific data, you actually accomplish that over mutation. Also, GraphQL allows you to do things like batch requests, where you can actually request for information of a batch, right? So some of those examples we'll simply get to them once we've started coding. So without wasting much of your time, let's quickly go ahead and open our code.quarkus.io and simply go ahead and create our project. So in this case, under group, I'm simply going to name the name of the company with the name of the channel, in this case StackDev, right? And for the artifact, I'm simply going to call it Quarkus GraphQL. Then for the build tool, you can choose the one that you want. So in this case, we are simply going to use Quarkus with Kotlin instead of Java. So if you are interested in Java tutorials, I also have Java tutorials in Spring. For the dependencies that I need, first of all, I need the Kotlin library, right? So that all the things will be written in Kotlin in this case. And I simply need one package, right? So in this case, I need the GraphQL from Smallrow, right? So I simply pick this Quarkus Smallrow GraphQL. So once you have selected your dependencies, you simply go ahead and say download and open that project in your favorite IDE. So in this case, I have extracted my project, and here's my project. So for the most part, you should be able to receive a project structure similar to this, that we have the Docker files. In this case, since I'm using Kotlin, if you're using Java, it will have a base package called Java here. Then for the most part, it will have a single resource, right? So since I've chosen that package called GraphQL, by default it comes with this hello world resource from GraphQL. So let's simply go ahead and quickly run the project. So in this case, I'm going to say GraphQL. So in this case, I'm going to say Gradle, and I run Quarkus dev, right? So this is how you run your Quarkus project, right? So while it's building, so if you are running this for the first time, it's going to take a couple of seconds. So in my case, I've already run this before, so it doesn't take time, right? So once you run this, just quickly go ahead and jump to your browser, and in this case, try to run your localhost. So in this case, it's localhost 8080 / this is the graph UI, right? So it's 8080 / kills / graph UI, right? Once you hit the graph UI, it will have anything. I think it's caching some data that I've written. So for the most part, you will receive a blank page like this. So we have noticed that it has a hello world example. So basically, this is the UI that will sort of like simulate your GraphQL client, right? So in order for us to query the object that we have so far, well, we simply need to put the opening curly braces, right? So in this case, if we want to run the first endpoint that is there in our project, so in this case, it is a query data, which means you can actually run query requests to our graph, right? So since this query is not annotated with any specific name, by default it will use this function name, which is the hello world, right? And we can actually see that this function, it takes an argument, in this case called name, and it also has a default argument called world, right? So which means if you run this without providing a specific name, it should return world as the default value for the name. So in this case, it will say hello world, right? So let's simply go ahead and try to run this. So in this case, if I say hello, right? So say hello was our default function name, right? In this case, right? So if I run say hello, in this case, right, what it does is it simply return hello world, right? So hello world, since the function was injecting a variable, was it called world or hello? Okay, so it was called, so it had a default value called world. So in this case, it just simply print hello world. So this name is replaced by the default one called world, right? So how do we actually go ahead and inject the data that we want to run, right? Because as you can see from this function name or from this query, called say hello, it takes an argument, right, called name, right? So how do we pass an argument over our graph client? You simply go ahead and annotate and open curly braces since it's a function. So in this case, the function, it takes name as an argument, and then we just put full colon, and then you can simply say, simply pass the name as an argument, right? So in this case, I've simply put the name of this channel, right? So in this case, I can say run. So if I run this query, it will then say hello StackDev, right? So in this tutorial, we're going to create a service. We're going to pretend that we're a banking API and want to provide a specific service to our clients where they can actually go ahead and query some basic banking data, like for example, getting accounts, getting bank name and branches, and also the accounts that are linked to a specific bank, right? So this would make sense, for example, for a banking service, right? Because you would want to, if you have an API of a bank on a specific bank, you can actually provide services that the client might require. So which means the client won't actually go ahead and fetch all the information that has to do with that bank, but they can actually describe the information that they want to query over in Graph API. So see you in the next one. All right, so for the most part, if you follow my tutorials, you know that I like to separate my data into different packages. So the first package that I'm going to create is called models. So inside these models, I'm just going to create a few Kotlin data classes. So the first data class that I'm going to create is called account. So inside this account data class, I'm going to have fields like the name, right? So this will represent, and I initialize it to now. Then I can have the account number, right? I can also have the client, right? Because I can have something called, let's say, balance, right? So this is just a random object, right? So this client is going to represent the actual client or customer, right? So in this case, I'm going to create another data class called client, right? So inside this client, right, so I'm simply going to have, I have some variables that I have on a separate file, right? So I can simply go ahead and paste them here, right? So in this case, I'm going to have the first name, last name, ID number, age, and created, right? So these are the customer data. Then for the account, I had the name of the account, the account number, and the client that is linked to this account, and then the balance, for example. Then the last data class that I can create, it's called, let's say, bank, right? So inside this bank data class, I'm going to have the name of the bank, right? And I'm going to have something called bank code, whatever that is. And then for the bank, you want to know which you're going to have a relationship between the bank and the branch, because we want to know this can be known. We want to know which branch does this bank belong to. Then we want to have something called accounts, which is going to be a list of accounts, right? So in this case, we are saying for this bank, how many accounts does it have? So all the accounts that are associated with this specific bank, we're simply going to have a list of an account here. Then inside this class, I can create something called branch. So these are just models, right? So this has nothing to do with GraphQL. We're just simply shaping how we want our data to be represented. So this is the branch name, and then this is the branch code, for example, right? So once we have your models set up, I'm simply going to have one last package quickly that is called services, right? So this is a service package, right? So inside this service package, I'm going to create a class called bank service, right? And this is going to be a class, right? So inside this bank service class, the first thing that I need to do, since I need to inject this bank service in our resource class, I need to make sure that it's scoped so that when we run this application, we can actually go ahead and find it, right? So inside this bank class, I'm going to simply declare a few variables, right? So in this case, I'm going to have something called bank. So in this case, I'm not going to have a repository or a database or something. I'm simply going to hard code most of the things inside this banking service, right? So let's simply import this bank, and then this one I will simply want to say it has to be a mutable list, because I simply want to be able to capture stuff during runtime of our program. So it has to be a mutable list. So I'm simply going to have bank, then I'm going to have a list of clients as well. I can also have a list of accounts, then I can have a list of let's say branches, right? A list of branches. How do I spell branches? Okay, like so. So in this case, this is going to be a list of branches, right? Then this is going to be a list of accounts from our models. Then I can also have a list of clients, right? This is from our models, right? So once I have these three objects, for me to be able to manipulate this data during runtime, I'm going to put them in a constructor, right? So in this case, I'm simply going to say initialize stuff here, right? So for the things that I want to initialize, for the most part, I want to initialize our accounts, right? I want to initialize our accounts. So I'm simply going to initialize the accounts. So in this case, I have a file that I've copied some stuff. So what I'm simply doing, since I already have a list of accounts, so just take this as, let's say, initializing, getting all the data from our database and install it in the accounts service or repo, so to speak. So in this case, I'm simply going to add an account, Daniel Matthew, the account number, the balance, and then the name, the hold of this client, then the age, right? So I have account 1, account 2. So this is just adding data, right? And then I want to also initialize my branches, right? So in this case, I'm going to create 2 branches, right? So this just so I've created branch 1, New Delhi 2, the branch code 0102, and then I'm going to add these 2 branches in my branch list, right? Then the third one, I'm simply going to initialize now the banks, right? So this was initialize the branches. Then the third one, simply going to initialize the banks. So I'm simply going to say banks.add, then I'm going to add this bank 1, then I also add bank 2, right? And these are the bank codes, right? So once I've initialized these banks, right? If this is too fast for you, just pause the video. And also I'm simply going to share this inside the GitHub repository. So the reason why I'm fast tracking this is, for now, this has nothing to do with GraphQL. So I simply want to fast track this, right? So I'm simply going to create a couple of services, right, to query this data, right? So for the most part, I'm just going to create some CRUD services, right? So in this case, I simply have my file. So let me just paste it and then we'll go through it together. So in this case, I've created a service that is called list banks. So in this case, it's simply return a mutable list of banks. It's simply going to return banks, right? So since we've initialized the banks, this function or this service name called list banks just return the list of banks. So in this case, I have also another one called create client. So in this part, we're simply going to pass our client as an object, and then we add it to our lists, and then we return the client that would have created in this case. Then create account does the same thing. Then list accounts does the same thing. Then we also have something called get account by ID. So in this case, you pass the ID of that specific list for a specific client, and then you return it, right? Then we also have bank code, right? So I'm simply going to allow now safety here. So get branch by ID does the same thing. Get banks by branch, right? So we might want to get the banks because there's a relationship between a bank and a branch, right? So in this case, a bank belongs to a specific branch, right? So we can get the bank by the branch, right? So this is what I'm simply doing, right? So what I'm simply doing here is I simply stream across our lists of banks, and then I'm going to filter a bank where I'm simply going to get all the banks where the branch, in this case, the unique identifier for the branches is the branch code, right? So where the branch code is equals to this, and also it's also contained in this specific bank, right? So in this case, this is just a filter query where we are simply annotating like that where query where branch code is equals to that, right? So I'm going to get all banks where the branch code is equals to the branch code that I would have provided in this case. Then once I get the data, I'll simply collect it. This is functional programming, Java 8, right? So once I get the list of banks, then I'll simply collect it in a list, right? So in this case, it will return a mutable list of banks. Delete bank is the same thing. Since I'm using a mutable list, I can remove a specific ID. You provide the ID, you delete it. Update bank is the same thing. You update account, I mean. So you update the account and then the ID that you want to update. Then you simply update the data. Then you return the updated account, right? So this is our simple service. There's nothing much here. So the reason why I created this, I didn't want to create the repository because it was sort of like drive away from the main objective, which in this case we simply want to look at GraphQL, right? So now I'm simply going to create one last package called resources or controllers or whatever you want to name it, right? So in this case, I'm going to name it controllers. Then inside this controller package, I'm simply going to create a resource file called bank resource. So in this case, I'm going to create a class called bank resource, right? So I'm not going to use the default one that comes, the hello world one. I'm simply going to create a new one, right? So inside this bank resource, this is where we simply want to do our things. So just like what was in this bank resource, the first thing that you simply need to do to annotate, to tell GraphQL that this is going to be our endpoint. So for the most part, in this case, this is going to be the GraphQL. You annotate this bank resource with GraphQL, right? Then the next thing that I simply want to do, I simply want to inject my bank service class that we just created. So in this case, I'm going to inject it. So it's called bank service, right? So this is called bank service. So I'm simply going to inject my bank service, right? So once I inject my bank service, we can actually go ahead and start writing queries, right? So the first query that I simply want to write is called, let's say, get all accounts, right? So this is just a get request. Want to get all accounts, right? So in the GraphQL world, right, it's called a query, right? So in this case, you can simply go ahead and say, want to return a list of all the accounts that are in our system, right? So in this case, I'm simply going to say return bank service dot I think we have something called list accounts, which returns a list of accounts, right? So if you just do this, so the next thing that you simply want to do once you have written your resource method, you simply want to annotate this with query, right? Right, because if you don't annotate it, GraphQL won't be able to know what this is, right? So if you annotate this with query, it means the default method is called get account, right? So you can also put description just to make your API a little bit more readable. So here you can actually say we want to get all accounts, right? So if I save this, right, so remember Quarkus, it does hot reload. So if I simply go ahead and jump to my browser, right, and I need to write a new resource. So this is called get. So for some reason my Quarkus is not refreshing, is not doing some water load for some reason. All right, so here's what I noticed. So initially I had something called get all accounts, right? So since I just had query, so what happens with GraphQL is if we have things that starts with things like get, right, it will just ignore the get and then take the other default common case name, right? So in this case, if I had, it was show me all my accounts, right, instead of get all accounts, right? So it will remove this get and then it will just default to accounts, right? So if you still want to have some sort of control with your API client, so in this case, if I explicitly specify that I want this to be called, let's say get all accounts, for example. So if I say get all accounts and then I save this in this case, and then I can simply say okay, so let me refresh this. Okay, so I need to refresh this, and I can say yes. So if I say get all accounts like so, in this case, right, so like my function is now realized, right? So if I don't explicitly define the query inside with a name, this is something that I was going to explain later, but for the most part, if you have a get keyword, it will just default to all my accounts. It will ignore the get, right, in this case. So in this case, for my account, I can specifically query the data that I want, right? So for this case, I know that I have an account object. So in this case, the account had name. So in this case, I can just request for the name, right? So if I want to request for, so the account object, it had stuff like name, then it also had, I think, account number. So in this case, I can say account number, right? I can even say balance, right? So what you request is what you get, right? So in this case, you can actually see that it returns a list of accounts with the name, account number, query, and balance, right? So this is the beauty, right, of GraphQL, right? Because it actually allows you to query data, so which means you don't overfetch data, right? So the data or the services that you want to subscribe to, or the information that you want per se, is the information that you get, right? Let's simply create another endpoint. Let's say code get accounts, and let's say by ID or something, right? So if I simply go back to my function, I can simply go and create code get account by ID, right? So in this case, right, so if you want to specify an attribute, right, you can provide a name keyword, right? So from GraphQL. So in this case, I want to say I want it to take a field, let's say called account ID, and then this account ID is simply going to be an integer, right? So since this is an annotated field, I need to put it in quotes, right? So in this case, I can say this it returns a single object of an account. Then I can use my bank service that we created. Then I can say get by account ID. In this case, I simply pass the ID. Then for this get requests, I'm going to annotate it with query, right? So in this case, the query, I can explicitly name it as okay, so in this case, let me not name it, right? So if I don't name it, we expect that GraphQL will simply write something called account by ID, right? Refresh the browser. So in this case, I can say account by ID, right? Can you see this? So here it says account by ID, but in this case, it removed that get, right? So since this takes an argument, in this case the ID, in this case I return it account ID. I can simply say account ID, and then I pass the specific account that I want to get, right? So since I pass the specific account that I want to get, right? So since an account is an object, it has specific fields, right? Remember, so in this case the account object, we had things like account number, we had, I think, was it balance or balance or something, name, and etc. So here I can simply okay, so I might not have two accounts. Oh, so since we had two accounts, this was an index. It's using an array index, right? So it has 0 1. So in this case, let's get the first account. It was the 0th index. Boom, dot. So in this case, I can get the 0th index since our API is using a list. There's no ORM that we're using in this case. We simply injected data in a list, right? So in this case, it will return the data in the specific shape that you have asked the data for in this case, right? So this is how you get your account by specific ID. So remember, this account, it also had an object called client, right? So in this case, let's say we want to know which client is in this account. So remember, so you simply put client, right? And then for that client, again, you need to specify the data that you want in that specific object. So client, it had things like first name, let's say it also had things like last name, I don't know, age, and even created or something, right? So we can get this information, right? So this is the power of GraphQL, right? So it means you can actually detect the data that you want to use, right? So we notice that the account, it has a relationship with the client, right? Because for a specific account, would want to know the client that holds that account. So you can actually go ahead and query that information and get it here. GraphQL, it also allows you to actually query data using something called source, right? So what source does is it allows you to actually write a GraphQL query and pass it as a parameter to get data, right? So let's simply go ahead and demonstrate that. This was from the previous era when we tried to get an out of bound index. So if I say, let's say I can create an endpoint that say, let's say get banks by branch code or something, right? So in this case, right? So in this case, we want to be able to pass a source, right? So the source that we're going to pass is going to be a branch, right? So in this case, we want to simply return a mutable list of banks, right? So remember, we have a relationship between the bank and the branch, right? So we want to be able to get all banks that belongs to a specific branch. So in this case, I'm simply going to call my bank service called get banks by branch. Then I simply pass the branch. So if you still remember in our get banks by branch, so if I go to this, right, it was using the branch, specifically the branch code to actually get that specific bank, right? So if I go back to my code, right, so let's simply annotate this query. So in this case, I'm going to name it called, let's say, banks by branch, right? I can explicitly name this query. So in this case, right, so what we're simply saying is this query, in as much as it is getting all the banks by branch, is taking the branch as a source, right? So what this means is this source will be provided as a GraphQL query. So which means you can actually query this branch and also use it to query the other specific data. So this is the power of GraphQL. So for it to make a little bit sense, let's simply go ahead and use our graph client to actually query this specific request, right? So if I jump into my Chrome and then I refresh this page, right? So the query that we want to simply write is simply going to be called, so in this case, right, so remember I said that the source that we provided is a branch, right? So what you simply do here is you can start by actually providing providing the branch, right? So in this case, so since we're providing the branch, right, we need to have that branch as an API. So did I create it? I don't think I'd created it. So let's simply go ahead and jump back to our code, because right now as I tried to query the branch, it says the branch not found. So let's simply go ahead to our code. So before this bank by branch, okay, so my spellings are wrong as well. So it's banks by branch, right? So since I said the source is also a GraphQL query, so we need it, this means that we need to have this branch as a GraphQL query, right? So let's quickly create a branch query. So in this case, I want to say so for example, get branch by ID, right? So in this case, like what we did before, simply going to pass a branch ID. So in this case, this is going to be a branch ID which takes an integer, right? So in this case, this needs to return a specific branch. Then I can say bank service dot get by branch ID, then I pass the branch ID. So for my query, so since this is called get branch by ID, I'm simply going to call it and this explicitly call it branch, right? So what this means is we can actually go ahead and get this branch, right? So if I save this and I jump back to our Chrome, so if I refresh this, right, I should have this branch, right? So if I have this branch, I can say I can get things like the branch name and stuff. Okay, so the same sorry, so this was the branch by ID, so which means we need to pass the ID. So in this case, the ID, let's say I want to get the first branch, then I can say branch name and code, right? So in this case, right, so in this case, as you can see, this is similar to what we did to the previous query. We simply got our branch by ID, but the query name is called branch, right? But for the next one, right, the one that we want to write, the one that we said it's called source, right, the one that allows us to get banks by branch, providing the branch as a source. If I type banks by branch here, you can actually see that the banks by branch query is now showing, right? So what this means is this branch that we got here, this one, the one that has a name and a code, is the one that was specifically passing into this bank by branch. So the moment we say banks by branch, we are using this GraphQL query that got the specific branch and pass it to the bank by branch as a query. So in this case, I can simply say in this now, so remember the banks by branch, it was returning a list of banks, right? So banks, it had things like bank name, so it also has things like the accounts that are associated with that specific bank, right? So in this case, for the accounts, I can simply say I need the account name, I need the balance, I need the account number, right? So it has the, so in this case, so remember a specific, okay, so this might be confusing. So let me just quickly go back to my IntelliJ, right? So remember, this one, this is the query that we are running, the banks by branch, that provides branch as a source, and we said a source is simply a GraphQL query. So in this case, we have queried the get by branch ID, and we are simply passing it into the banks by branch, right? So inside this banks, so remember we said this returns a mutable list of banks, right? So the inside the banks, we said it has things like the bank name, bank code, also the branch as well, and then the list of accounts, right? So this is what we are simply doing. So if I jump back to my Chrome, we can actually see that this is the information that we simply passed, right? So if I run this query, it happens, right? So what first happened is we first got the branch, the bank by branch. So we got the branch ID 0, which was this one, the HLM New Delhi 001, right? And then inside that, right, we simply further to say, okay, we want to get all the banks that are associated with this specific branch. So just to show you, in this case, these are the banks, right? It's a list of banks that are associated with that branch. So in this case, these are the bank's name, and remember we also asked for accounts. So these are the accounts that are associated with the specific data. So remember, if I remove balance will not be shown here, right? This is the power of GraphQL. So if I remove balance and I rerun it, you can see that balance is gone. So the way you shape your data, you detect how you want your data to be returned. So in this case, this is what you get, right? So just to prove to you, I think the bank, since it's also, we can also get the branch again, right? So we can also simply let's say branch code, just to show you that the first branch that we're getting. So in this case, this is the branch code. This is the branch that is associated with these banks, right? So this is how you do the source query using GraphQL, right? So for the most part, I think we've been doing the GET requests, right? So in REST API, we call them GET requests, right? So how do you actually go ahead and update data, right? Or to create objects or to delete, just to make it a little bit of CRUD-ish, CRUD API. So let's simply go ahead and jump to our resource that we're working with, right? So inside this resource, we now want to look at mutation functions. So the first function that I'm going to create, so if you want to create an object, it's a create, right? And it returns the client as an object, right? So the data that we're going to pass in this case is simply going to be the client, right? And we need to annotate this with an annotation called mutation, right? So mutation, it means it allows you to actually go ahead and update a specific data. So if you want to update, to delete, to create any sort of mutation to your data, you use the mutation annotation. So in this case, we're simply going to call a service, and we're simply going to call the function called create client, right? So if I save this, right, and we simply jump to our browser, right, we simply want to do a quick mutation, right? So the way you do mutation, so if I refresh this page, right, so for the queries, remember we didn't necessarily need to annotate it with query, but for mutation, you need to start your queries with a mutation keyword, right? So in this case, we have a mutation keyword. Then inside the mutation, we then write the mutation name. So the first mutation that we have is called create client. So remember, this create client, it takes the client as an object, right? So the client that it takes as an object, we simply want to pass the data that we want to create. So we have things like first name. So in this case, I can say first name. I can say Daniel. Then it has last name. I can say, let's say StackDev. I can say ID number, right? So I can put some random ID number, age, right? So let's say Daniel is 45. So since this is a create client, right? So remember, the create client object was returning an object called client. So since it returns an object called client, we need to be specific in terms of the data, that the shape of the data that we want to see when it returns that specific object. So in this case, I can simply say, okay, when it returns the client that was created, I just want to see the age, for example. So for example, I want to immediately see the age of that specific client. I don't need the rest of the other data. I simply need the age. So if I hit it, right, you can actually see that it has created the client and it has returned the age of that specific client, right? So if I want to say I need the ID number, it's just a matter of updating our mutation, then I can get the age and the ID number of that specific client. So in this case, it means I now have two clients. right? So this is the power of GraphQL. So it means you don't have to go ahead and update your API and redo stuff, right? So let's quickly go ahead and create the last two. I know that this tutorial has been long already, so let's quickly go ahead and create the last two mutations. So the first one, I'm simply going to say code, let's say delete account, right? So remember, for the delete, we need to specify the ID for that specific account. So once you delete, we now want to return a list of all accounts that are available. So in this case, we are simply going to call our bank service dot delete account, then you pass the ID. Then remember, we annotate this with mutation, right? So this is a mutation. This is how you delete an account. Back to my browser and I refresh this, right? So in this case, again, this is a mutation and it's called delete account. So for the delete account, remember, it takes an ID. Let's say I want to delete the first account in this case. So remember, after you delete an account, it's going to return a list of accounts. So in this case, I'm simply going to want the account number and the balance for the remaining accounts that are not deleted. So if I run this mutation, you can actually see that it has deleted the first account, and in this case it has returned the account number and the balance for the remaining accounts. So in this case, we only have one account left. So for the most part, I think you can actually see a pattern here, that the way you relate to data, or the way you query information, be it a mutation or it's simply a normal query, the way you interact with the data is just the same. So the last mutation for the day, and I'm simply going to call it update account. So for the update account, I'm simply going to pass the account, remember the account object, and then in this case, I want to, I can even go ahead and specify the specific ID, right, as a named parameter. So we just want to demonstrate both ideas. So in this case, for the account, I want to return the updated account. So I'm simply going to call the bank service, then updated account, then I pass the account, then I pass the ID of the account that I want to update. Then in this case, it's a mutation, right? So, and then you simply save. So if we jump to our Chrome, we're going to simply refresh this. So remember, we said this is a mutation, so it was called update account, and the update account, it takes the account, right? So it takes the account, then it also takes was it the ID? Yeah, the account ID. So in this case, the account ID, I'm simply going to call it 0. So for the account that it takes, I'm simply going to pass the data that I want to update. So in this case, I want to update the account name to John, account number to Matthews, I don't know, yeah, Matthews, right, for example. Then remember, the update account, where does it end? Yeah, it returns the specific account that we've updated. So in this case, the name, account number, balance. I think it even has a client object that we can see the difference, because if I still remember, the account name and the bank account name, I think they were similar. So let's see. So if I run this mutation, yes, so if I run this mutation, you can actually see that the account name is now called John and the account number is now Matthews. So just to demonstrate this further, let's say, yeah, this is just an account number, right? So it doesn't matter. So in this case, it's now John, but the previous account, I think it was Matthew Daniels or something, right? So you can actually see that the data is now updated, right? So one thing that I think might be confusing that you really need to make sure that you got it right is when we have fields that we are passing. So for example, here we had to put it as a named field as account ID. This is something that you need to take care of. Then also inside that function, also we had the account, and remember to pass it as an object again, and then with as a sort of like a JSON object. Right. I know that this tutorial has been long, guys. Thank you so much for watching if you got this far. So this was just a basic introduction to GraphQL using Quarkus. If you have any questions, you can simply go ahead and hit me in the comment box, and I'll make sure that I try to respond to all your questions. So thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like, to subscribe, and share the video, and also to get feedback from me. Of course, this actually helps me going creating these more videos. So just let me know if this video was helpful to you. And for the most part, you can actually create a PR. I'm going to add more services, because I think there are some things that maybe we didn't touch, but you can actually always go ahead and create a PR, and then I'll make sure that I also cover them. So for the most part, this was just an introductory video just to get you comfortable with GraphQL using Quarkus. I hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you in the next one. Cheers.